What if the static humming from your bedroom vents isn't air, but the collective breathing of everyone who went missing in your town? What if the emergency alert broadcast on your television tonight lists your own name as the first casualty of an incident that hasn't happened yet? What if the long, empty highway you've been driving on for hours isn't taking you across the state, but slowly wrapping around your life like a noose? The automated voice of the digital recorder was the only consistent sound inside the cabin of the truck. Log entry, October 14th, 11:32 p.m. Highway 22 North, approaching the boundary of the Willamette National Forest, Oregon. Visual inspection of timber structures delayed due to heavy fog. David Vance clicked the device off and tossed it onto the passenger seat, his eyes straining against the thick gray bank of mist that had rolled off the Cascades. At 27, David worked as a structural safety inspector for the state park system, a tedious government job that usually involved checking the structural integrity of old observation towers, wooden footbridges, and historical cabins before the winter snows rendered the mountain passes impassable. He was a creature of logic and blueprint paper, comfortable with the predictable math of weight-bearing beams and concrete foundations. But tonight, the mountains felt entirely devoid of logic. The forest on either side of the asphalt didn't look like a collection of trees. It looked like a wall of jagged black spears cutting through the heavy mist. He had been driving for nearly 40 miles without seeing another set of taillights, a gas station, or a highway sign. The heater in his state-issued pickup truck was blasting on high, yet the air inside the cab remained bone-chillingly cold, smelling faintly of ozone, damp moss, and a strange, sharp, metallic tang that reminded him of wet copper pennies. He reached out to adjust the temperature dial, but as his fingers touched the plastic, the truck's dashboard digital clock began to glitch. The green numbers rolled over erratically. 11:34, 03, 12, 08:45, before spinning backwards so fast they became a steady, vibrating blur. Simultaneously, the smartphone mounted to his air vent buzzed violently. The 5 bars of cellular service dropped instantly to a flat, dead zero, and the blue navigation arrow on his GPS application began to spin in tight geometric circles against a featureless black background. David frowned, tapping the screen, but the phone's display suddenly inverted into a deep, bruised purple. A single line of text typed itself across the screen, independent of any open application. Structural load exceeded. Clear the deck. Before he could process the message, the truck's AM/FM radio erupted into a deafening wall of white noise. David winced, reaching for the volume knob, but the dial spun loosely under his hand. The static didn't fade. Instead, it began to shape itself into a rhythmic, multi-layered pattern. It sounded like the synchronized whispering of dozens of people speaking in perfect, breathless unison from the bottom of a very deep well. They weren't speaking gibberish. They were repeating his name. David. David. The bridge is down, David. Panic, cold and sudden, spiked in his chest. He slammed his foot on the brakes. The truck's heavy tires locked up on the slick, wet asphalt, the vehicle skidding 90 degrees across the center line before coming to a hard, shuddering halt. The headlights cut through the swirling fog, illuminating the edge of the road. Except it wasn't the edge of the road anymore. The highway didn't continue into the mountains. It stopped completely at the edge of a massive, overgrown clearing that didn't exist on any map David had ever studied. He unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his heavy tactical flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The silence of the forest was absolute. No wind, no crickets, no distant rumble of traffic. Just the sound of his own ragged breathing forming thick white plumes of frost in the flashlight's beam. He walked toward the front of his truck, shining the light into the clearing. Rising out of the overgrown ferns and wild brambles was a massive skeletal wooden structure. It was an abandoned multi-story logging mill and railway transfer station, its dark timber framing towering over the trees like a rotting monument to a forgotten century. A line of rusted iron railway tracks emerged from the dense forest, cutting straight through the center of the clearing and disappearing beneath the mill's collapsed wooden loading bay. Near the tracks stood a weathered, splintered wooden notice board. Nailed to the center of the board with a thick, hand-forged iron spike was a brittle yellow document inside a cracking plastic sleeve. David stepped closer, the wet grass crunching beneath his boots. He wiped the layer of condensation off the plastic and shined his light on the document. It was an official state investigative report dated November 14th, 1964. The bold, typewriter-stamped headline at the top read, "Incident Report, Site 12 Mining and Lumber Colony, Total Evacuation Exceeded." According to the faded text, an entire shift of 84 loggers and railway workers had walked into the main mill building for the midnight shift 62 years ago. When the morning supervisor arrived at dawn, the boilers were still burning, the coffee was hot in the break room, and the logs were half cut on the saws, but every single human being had vanished without a trace. The state had officially declared them missing, sealed the perimeter, and erased Site 12 from all commercial transit maps. A sudden sharp crack echoed from the upper deck of the mill building, directly above the railway tracks. David spun around, swinging the heavy beam of his flashlight upward. The light illuminated a row of shattered, empty window frames on the third floor of the timber structure. The old wood was weeping dark, viscous sap that looked black under the flashlight. Then he saw it. A heavy, uneven thud-thud-thud began to vibrate through the wooden framework of the loading bay. Something was walking across the elevated catwalks. But the cadence of the footsteps wasn't human. It was a jerky, disjointed rhythm, accompanied by the sickening sound of snapping wood and tearing sinew, as if a heavy, broken biological frame was being Nordic dragged across the beams by invisible, violent wires. "We need to log the final dimensions, David," a voice erupted from the darkness of the loading bay. It didn't sound like a single man speaking. It was a terrifying, multi-layered chorus of dozens of different voices, gruff old woodsmen, trembling young apprentices, and breathless engineers, all speaking in a flat, monotone unison that resonated directly inside the fluid of David's ears. David staggered backward, his boots slipping in the mud. "Who's there?" "I'm a state inspector. This property is restricted." The footsteps stopped right at the edge of the open loading bay door, 30 feet above the ground. Out of the deep shadow of the roof stepped a figure. It wore a heavy, grease-stained oilskin canvas coat and thick laced leather boots from the mid-century, but its anatomy was fundamentally wrong. The figure's limbs didn't bend at natural joints. Its arms were elongated, hanging down past its knees, and its shoulders hitched up and down in a mechanical, insect-like rhythm. It looked like a carcass being manipulated by an amateur puppeteer. Slowly, with a series of wet, metallic pops, the figure tilted its head all the way back until its chin pointed directly toward the night sky, snapping its neck at a horrific, broken 90-degree angle. As the beam of David's flashlight finally hit its face, a choked, sobbing scream caught in his throat. The entity had no face. It was a completely smooth, featureless mask of pale, bloodless flesh stretched tightly over a human skull. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank canvas of damp skin. But beneath the translucent surface, something was violently alive. Dozens of thick, dark, worm-like tendrils were writhing and tunneling under the flesh, aggressively punching outward from the inside, desperate to shape the blank mass into human features. The blank skin began to violently ripple, boil, and warp. Within seconds, the shifting flesh settled into a perfect, terrifying copy of David's own face. It was a mirror image, but the eyes were hollowed-out sockets swimming with a thick, pulsing black fluid, and the mouth split open far too wide, stretching from ear to ear to reveal rows of jagged, needle-like ivory teeth. The entity smiled and spoke, using David's own precise voice, but infected with an ancient, predatory hunger. "Why are you checking the foundation, David? You're already part of the framework. Step onto the platform." Absolute psychological terror shattered his rational mind. This wasn't a phantom or a ghost. It was an ancient, supernatural force that inhabited the geography of the mountains, a shape-shifting anomaly that had digested the entire population of Site 12 and was now using their collective forms, memories, and voices to hunt its next meal. It was a living pocket of broken reality that rewrote physical space, copying the faces of the living to drag them down into its architecture. Suddenly, the forest around the clearing came alive with whispering. Thousands of voices began to bleed from the bark of the pine trees and the mud beneath his boots. "Check the load. Secure the bridge. Stay in the timber." The deep shadows cast by the trees detached themselves from the ground, sliding across the wet grass like spilled black ink, all slithering rapidly toward his ankles. As they entered the light of his flashlight, the shadows rose, taking on the grotesque, half-formed silhouettes of men holding rusted axes and iron spikes, their elongated arms stretching out to grab his clothes. Time completely disintegrated. The digital display on David's truck dashboard, visible through the open driver's side door, began to spin backward into the mid-1900s at a frantic, blurring speed. Adrenaline finally broke through his paralysis. David turned on his heel and sprinted back toward his truck. Behind him, he heard a catastrophic crash as the entity wearing his face jumped from the third-story platform, landing heavily on all fours in the mud. Its limbs bent backward with sickening wet cracks as it pursued him across the clearing with a rapid, spider-like skittering speed. David threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy metal door shut and throwing the manual locks just as a massive, pale hand with elongated fingers shattered the passenger side window. Shards of safety glass exploded into the cab like shrapnel as a chorus of 84 dead voices screamed his name through the opening, trying to reach across the console to grab his throat. David slammed the truck into reverse and floored the gas pedal. The engine roared in protest, the heavy tires spinning wildly in the deep mud before catching the hard edge of the asphalt. He threw the vehicle into drive, speeding backward down Highway 22 at 90 miles an hour, ignoring the shattering metal and the screaming alerts on his dashboard. In his rearview mirror, the headlights illuminated the entity wearing his own face, its body unfolding as it ran down the center of the road behind him, gaining ground with every second. He drove blindly through the swirling mist and torrential rain for what felt like an eternity, pushed entirely by raw, frantic survival instinct, until the jagged wall of the forest finally broke apart, revealing the familiar, glowing neon streetlights of the city. The storm had passed, and a weak, gray morning light was breaking over the horizon when David finally pulled his battered, glass-shattered truck into the driveway of his suburban home in Eugene. He was hyperventilating, his hands cut and bleeding from the broken glass, his entire body shaking from profound physical and mental exhaustion. He bolted out of the truck, ran up his front steps, and locked the front door with every deadbolt, chain, and security latch he owned. He collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the carpet, gasping for air as tears of pure relief spilled over his cheeks. He forced his mind to rationalize the nightmare. It was a hallucination caused by sleep deprivation, extreme stress, and carbon monoxide poisoning from a hidden leak in the old truck's exhaust pipe. Yes, that had to be it. The human mind plays terrifying tricks in the dark when you're staring into the fog. He was back in his own house now. The forest was miles away. He was safe. An hour passed in absolute, agonizing silence as the morning sun filled his living room, casting long, familiar shadows across the furniture. The warmth of the apartment slowly calmed his frayed nerves, and his breathing finally stabilized. Then, a soft, deliberate metallic scrape echoed from the bottom of the front door, right behind his head. David froze, every muscle in his body locking into place as a cold sweat broke out across his skin. He turned his head slowly, watching in absolute horror as the small brass mail slot on the front door slowly pushed open from the inside of the house. There were no footsteps on his porch outside, no cars on the street. A small, heavy object slid through the narrow slot, landing on the hardwood floor with a loud, distinct metallic thud, followed by a pristine piece of folded white blueprint paper that slid smoothly across the carpet.
His heart stopping in his chest, David forced his trembling legs to move, crawling on his hands and knees toward the items. Lying on the floor was his own digital voice recorder, its screen cracked and smeared with thick black industrial sap. With a hand that shook so violently he could barely hold it, David picked up the folded piece of blueprint paper and opened it. Written across the drafting lines in a precise, elegant, and chillingly familiar handwriting. His own handwriting was a single line of text. "The final inspection is complete, David. Your house was built over the loading bay, and the floorboards are about to give way."